https://utb/uini_j1pqk?si=JJGAWMFJGU9YC Brave men save lone moose from giant lizard's vicious attack. The marsh water vibrates like taut skin beneath the tail's blow, the mud parts in dark streaks, and the monitor lizard's elongated body tears through the surface with the precision of a live projectile. Ahead, a lone moose staggers, one antler chipped, the other smeared with dried mud, its flank marked with ancient scratches that betray nights of hunger and days of flight. The wind carries a metallic smell, a mixture of diluted blood and crushed leaves, while riverside birds circle high and silently, sensing the outcome. On the bank, quick footsteps leave fresh footprints in the damp bank. 3 men emerge carrying ropes, a rolled-up containment blanket, and a handheld siren battered by time. There is no time for long calculations. The reptile measures the distance, the moose sinks a paw into the puddle, and the small audience of onlookers, kept at bay by makeshift tape, sucks in their breath. For a seemingly suspended instant, the entire landscape contracts into a single luminous point. The collision between fear and courage, between hunger and life, between impassive nature and the human decision to intervene. It is here that the title phrase is etched like a stamp on the history of that floodplain. Brave men save a lone moose from the ferocious attack of a giant lizard. A phone camera shakes, an amateur drone tilts its lens, the park ranger in the background adjusts his hand on the non-lethal deterrent spray, but it still doesn't arrive. The 3 men form a semicircle, magnifying their silhouettes with the open blanket, making the shrill sound of the siren pierce the buzzing insects, and the lizard hesitates for half a second, a tiny recoil, almost a reflex, worth its weight in gold. The moose, however, remains trapped. The mud embraces its hooves and rises to its knees, pulling it down with an invisible force. The submerged roots offer treacherous resistance, and the puddle where it had earlier sought water has become a trap. The first man digs in his heels, throws the rope with aim honed by years of fast-flowing water, and the loop finds the animal's chest in a sharp gesture. The second, alert to the reptile's lateral movement, takes a step forward and vibrates the blanket to appear larger than normal. The third prepares to jet away, mindful of the wind, so as not to reverse the blow against itself. The lizard resumes its offensive, head lowered, tongue testing the air, tail describing an arc that promises to break legs if it touches it. The water sprays in fans, staining the shirts brown, and the crowd's murmurs fade to silence, as if everyone had agreed to disappear so that only the essential scene remained. The animal's weight, the strength of the hands, the predator's intelligence, the urgency of time. The boatman recognizes the edge of the bank and positions his body diagonally, transforming traction into leverage. The guide measures the space between the moose and the reptile and realizes that a frontal attack would be disastrous, that the only way out is to break the hunter's rhythm. The environmental technician mentally counts the safe distance, adjusts his grip, and fires a short spray without hurting anyone, just to create the respite fate owes him. The spray strikes a translucent veil, and the lizard blinks, offended not by pain but by discomfort, by the interference in the perfect calculation of the ambush. In that interval, the rope gains tension, the moose's body moves forward half a foot, its hoof finds an invisible step of root, its rump trembles, its breath settles higher in its chest. The tail then comes like an iron bar, blunt and violent, and strikes the blanket, which inflates, bends, and nearly rips off the shoulders of the man holding it. The impact echoes in the witness's ribs and imprints on their skin the reminder that nature does not negotiate. Still, the human semicircle reassembles itself. The second spray fails, the wind is changed, and the technician swallows his anxiety like someone swallowing bitter water, holds the trigger, and waits for the opening. A drone flies too low, the park ranger screams unheard, the propeller touches a branch, and the device falls out of frame. For a second, everyone looks in the wrong place, and the lizard takes the opportunity to cut diagonally, seeking the moose's exposed flank. The mud parts, the gleam of scales appears like wet daggers, and the boatman twists his entire torso, turning his own weight into an anchor. The rope sings, the fibers vibrate, the knot tightens. The moose lets out a hoarse sound, not of surrender, but of astonishment at still standing. The siren returns, loud and metallic, tearing at the reptile's instincts, which detest the unexpected. The guide moves 2 steps to the left, becoming a shadow larger than a human body. The technician finally hits the ground in front of the lizard, creating a salty fan that disrupts the touch of its forked tongue. The predatory head stops, suspended in a new calculation, And in this microspace of indecision, the world shifts its axis. The rope retracts another span, the moose's hind leg finds purchase, its hip rotates, and the mud releases its prey, first reluctantly, then angrily, finally in defeat. The animal falls sideways onto the dry bank, thrashing its chest against the grass, while the lizard corrects its course, offended, and retreats with the cool elegance of one who has learned that the next attempt requires different conditions. Clapping, sobbing, the snapping of branches under boots, the echo of distant engines. The scene leaves its own mark on the memory of those who were there, because the tension was not a spectacle, it was a choice. Yet the question that simmers beneath each gesture has yet to be answered. Why was the moose alone, thin, cut, entangled in roots that seemed to be waiting only for it? How did a predator of that size learn to use the tide and mud as such precise allies, like a craftsman uses a chisel, who scattered food scraps on the shore the day before, luring cautious footsteps into the shallows? The improvised ribbon that held onlookers also arose from a sequence of previous decisions, good and bad, fearful and courageous. Salvation in that moment is the end and, at the same time, the beginning of a thread that pulls other knots. On the other side of the marsh, a footprint too large to be confused with any other dries in the shade of a tree trunk, and attached to the bark, an opaque scale tells a piece of the story that is still missing. If anyone wants to understand how a moose was pushed to the brink and why three men decided to cross the line between observation and action, they must go back from the climax to the dawn, from the scream to the whisper, from the siren blast to the first broken twig. 12 hours earlier, the false peace had already been shattered, but no one had noticed. The morning had dawned as if nothing could go wrong. The blade of sunlight cut through the fine mist over the marsh, and the webs among the reeds held droplets that looked like tiny constellations. The moose walked slowly, head down, sniffing the damp wind, following trails that the body's memory knew even before the eyes. In the silence of the park, there was a tacit agreement of routine. Birds fished in calculated swoops, insects streaked the light in invisible paths, fish broke the water's film with discreet pops. Normal life, that comfortable mask, rested entirely on the surface. It was hard to believe, looking at it this way, that any thread was frayed. A few meters away, on the opposite bank, the boatman adjusted the motor as if tuning an instrument, the guide checked a backpack with almost ritualistic calm, and the environmental technician, on a voluntary visit, collected notes on tides and migration in a notebook that already contained other stations. Everyone seemed fitted into their small roles, like pieces of an obedient clock. The moose, however, bore signs on its hide that only reveal themselves when the light passes at just the right angle. Dark streaks of old scratches, a barely perceptible dent over its right rib, the thinner fur around its neck, as if something had brushed there too many times. As it approached the pool of water, it avoided, without knowing why, the clearest patch and went to drink from the murky pool in the shade of a fallen trunk. The water had a faint taste of decaying leaves, common in those days, but a distinct mineral trace lingered on its tongue, and it raised its head, alert to the reeds that swayed behind the wind. Nothing moved when it should have, and something moved when there was no breeze. The scene, however, restored its tranquility, and instinct filed the warning away in a deep corner. Fishermen chatted distantly. The community was waking for work, for the crossing, for repetition. This was how the marsh taught. First it lulls, then it charges. The three men crossed paths throughout the morning on tasks that, viewed in isolation, would have been meaningless. The boatman noticed wide tracks imprinting the mud at the canal entrance, parallel grooves in a low trunk that hadn't been there the week before. The guide, driven by a senseless curiosity, found an opaque scale stuck to the bark of a tree and quietly tucked it into his pocket, like someone picking up a curious pebble. The technician noted in his notebook the highest tide at dawn and a pattern of rising and falling tides that pushed small animals into pockets of shallow water at dawn. Each detail alone was just a detail. Together, they sketched the edge of a figure no one dared see in its entirety yet. The false piece persisted. The park welcomed visitors, a school filed past on a walkway, merchants opened windows and hung canvases to dry. The trigger came from where it almost always does, from a distracted glance that, by accident, became attentive. A child stumbled upon footprints much larger than those of cattle and called to the teacher with the silent urgency of open arms. A fisherman noticed the blood drawn in translucent rivulets, dissolving too quickly to be wounded by a branch. The herons took flight without the classic announcement of human footsteps, as if something flatter and lower was crossing the grass. A dog barked at the water, not at the shore. Small dissonances, like off-key notes, began to repeat themselves. Still, the chorus of everyday life insisted on keeping time. Someone swept the plank sidewalk, the roar of the engine covered the sound of something heavy sliding beneath the surface, and the morning continued as if intuition could overcome its weariness. The first strange signs lined up discreetly. The moose skirted the banks, preferring high trails, and twice avoided the same shallow watering hole where it always stopped. The larger birds perched on medium-sized branches, leaving the tops free, as if unwilling to be silhouetted against the sky. In the grass, a shallow tunnel appeared overnight, a groove polished by comings and goings that didn't match the nervous haste of a capybara. The fallen trunk where the moose drank had new marks, polished by something rough, and beneath the hoof of a root appeared a mixture of mud and grease that didn't belong there. Each clue silently called for the construction of a map. And the map, if drawn, would inevitably lead to the heart of the ambush. There was resistance, as there always is when reality threatens the comforts of routine. Some residents downplayed the footprints, saying the tide creates illusions. Others laughed at the scale, reducing it to marsh dirt. The idea of a large predator controlling the tidal cycle and calculating the best time to attack seemed like an excess of imagination. It was easier to believe that nature would organize itself, that balance, a word so often repeated and so misunderstood, would resolve the discomfort. The boatman chose to remain silent at first, weighing the weight of his words on his own livelihood. The guide felt his pockets heavier because of the scale he didn't want to show. The technician, accustomed to seeing alerts fall into oblivion, took a deep breath and resolved to observe more, gather more information, before activating any sirens. The false peace survived for a few extra hours, stitched together by excuses, pinned by signals. As the sun slipped from its zenith and cast long shadows over the reeds, the routine began to fail irreversibly. The moose, exhausted from avoiding, chose a shorter route to the water and on that shortcut, stepped into a patch of mud that gave way like quicksand. The hoof sank deeper than expected, the rump sought non-existent purchase, and it remained trapped long enough for the scent of its exertion to reach where it shouldn't. At the same moment, beneath the immobile appearance of a dark trunk, ancient eyes calculated distances. There was no rush, only method. The lizard, patient as one who reads tides in bone, repositioned itself with the strategic slowness of those who succeed through economy. The false peace finally crumbled, and the awakening had no trumpets, but a thick silence where each relevant sound appeared isolated, clear, inescapable. The crackle of compressed grass, the bursting bubble bringing salt from the depths, the heavy breathing that doesn't belong to mammals. The men moved almost at the same moment, pulled by an invisible magnet that had formed during the day without their realizing it. The boatman turned off the engine and let the boat stall, so as not to alarm the wrong shore. The guide repositioned his backpack, no longer as a ritual gesture, but as if consulting a plan finally drawn up. The technician closed his notebook and felt the concrete weight of what he had written down. High tide at dawn, a slight drop at dawn, a shallow watering hole exposed in the late morning, double trails back and forth. The pieces fell into place with a cold snap. There was no longer any retreat to the comfort of easy explanations. From that point on, every second would gain the status of a decision. And it was in this narrow corridor between habit and consciousness that history began to move to the place where everyone would see it. What the camera would show hours later, brave men saving a lone elk from a ferocious attack, was already written in the discreet folds of this seemingly perfect morning when peace, without warning, woke up too tired to keep pretending. As the tide withdrew the last of the midday glow, the terrain revealed what the water had patiently hidden. In the newly exposed mud, a corridor of footprints traced a precise arrow toward the shallow watering hole. These were not scattered marks of random passage. They formed two parallel trails, back and forth, with regular intervals and gradual depths, as if the weight had been calculated with each step. At the beginning of the corridor, beneath a tangle of roots, emerged the central object of truth, an ambush nest, dug by repetition, polished by scales and tail, rounded in the center to shelter the predator's long body. There the plants were trimmed by friction, and at the bottom remained a thin layer of fat mixed with mud, a varnish that did not belong to mammals. Curled in a crevice, half of a larger scale, opaque and slightly curved. It provided the tactile confirmation that the eye lacked. The guide carefully removed it, and the environmental technician, seeing it side by side with the smaller one kept in his pocket since morning, felt the outline of the trial close like a lid. A first solid revelation, it came at dusk, when the students' hastily repaired hobby drone rose again and hovered a little higher. The lens pointed at the puddle captured the complete pattern. The monitor lizard, half submerged, occupying the nest like a piece fitted into a mold. Half-closed eyes turned toward the corridor, tongue testing the air with a lazy cadence that betrayed calculation. The moose appeared out of focus on the right edge, hesitating between two tracks. The camera, on automatic, corrected the light, and the frame, finally, froze the evidence. Positioned predator, press on the road, prepared environment. The recording continued for a few minutes, long enough to capture the reptile's millimeter-sized movement, the almost imperceptible lowering of its head, and the alignment of its body with the direction of its shell. There was no benign hypothesis for that set. Still, Thedini Alit wasn't long before the kayak rental vendor dismissed the reading, attributing the nest's design to chance. An influential Riverside resident, concerned about the park's image, spread the story that the marks were from large capybaras and that the drone distorted proportions. Comments multiplied on street corners and on boats like foam blown by the wind, diminishing the problem until it fit into a late afternoon conversation. The previously confident guide realized that the larger scale now weighed heavily as evidence and, at the same time, as a reason for distrust for those who preferred the comfort of any explanation. The boatman, balancing his responsibility and his livelihood, calculated the invisible damage that would come with the unwanted headline. The technician, a student of the persistence of facts, recognized the texture of resistance. When the truth threatens the routine reacts. The insulation it set in first as a discreet chill, then as a headwind. Smiles faded, greetings were delayed, invitations to observe calmly reduced to practical silences. The trio, which hours before had been moving like a cog, had to redistribute forces without fuss. The technician compared tide times with moose routes and noted alternative ambush points. The guide mapped safe access points for retreat. The boatman discreetly coordinated hand signals that would replace ineffective shouts when the decision was made. The crowd, which so often becomes an audience before becoming an accomplice, preferred not to watch. The park at dusk carried a seemingly innocent glow, and that appearance is always an ally of those who desire keep the mask on. A villain's mask remained intact for a few more hours because the villain wasn't a character with a human face asking for credit. It was a natural mechanism honed by time, invisible to the hurried eye. On the surface, the marsh returned to postcard form. Beneath its smooth skin, the reptile reorganized its plan. The next tide promised more silence, and the corridor of footprints, competently trodden, would once again receive a visit from the moose, who had not yet learned to fear that specific point on the map. The images existed, the scales existed, the grooves in the wood existed. What didn't exist for many was the desire to believe in the inconvenience. And denial, honed by convenience, found its way into every corner. A veiled threat came and signed. At the dock, someone left a bag with guts and fish remains, just a few meters from the high path that led to the watering hole. It wasn't forgotten trash. It was attraction planted, a wrong invitation in the right direction. The strong scent traveled low, like a dense breeze seeking edges. Beside the bag, deeper than usual boot prints marked recent comings and goings. The message needed no words. If the scandalous story took shape, accidents would have convenient culprits. Later, near the boatman's shed, someone scratched a crude arrow on the wood pointing to the water with 3 lazy letters meant to laugh at the danger. Cheap humor, as always, served to mask the real intention. Demoralize the alert. Still, the sequence of concrete evidence had already crossed the threshold of return. The drone records were copied, the largest scale placed in an envelope, the nest coordinates mentally signaled by 3 people who could no longer unsee what they saw. The trio decided that the next tidal window in the early evening would require silent positioning and double-angle surveillance, with the boat serving as a fixed shadow and the high trail as an approach route. There would be no more room for the aesthetics of denial when the long body emerged, for the 3rd time, from the same polished hole. The park, indifferent, lit fireflies. The community, busy, put away chairs and closed doors. The moose, obedient to its fatigue, repeated the short path that had given it water in the morning. Night, complicit in its strategies, brought back the geography of the trap. At the first snap of compressed reeds, the map was confirmed. The lizard glided with the cool elegance of those who don't need to accelerate, settled into its nest as if returning to a custom-made chair, and raised its head just enough to align distance and angle. The moose gave way to the mud, gaining in exchange a centimeter of descent that negated the advantage of its hoof. The boatman felt the rope under his hand before seeing the silhouette. The guide recognized the gleam of scales against the gloom. The technician realized that all the numbers in the notebook were now bodies. Discovery it was no longer a thesis, it was a scene. And the denial, which still echoed through closed doors and easy laughter, would have to be measured against what the night itself, in its frankness, could not hide. There was little air left between the evidence and the impact, and this narrow interval would be used to the last thread by the courage that had been silently building since the first scale in the pocket. In the early hours of the morning, the strategy emerged from the drawing board and filled the shore like a piece-by-piece mechanism. The boat was anchored noiselessly in the shade of a willow tree, becoming a fixed point for pulling and pulling back. On the high trail, discrete and aligned reference stakes marked approach angles. The main rope was secured at calculated intervals to redistribute weight in the event of a lurch. The containment blanket, now reinforced with shorter cables, was folded so it could open in one go, multiplying human dimensions in a practiced gesture. The technician adjusted narrow-beam flashlights to cut through the darkness without blinding the team, and set silent alarms on the watch to follow the tide's curves. The guide traced the texture of the largest scale with his fingers in his pocket, remembering that each groove there was an ancient warning. The boatman tested the rope's weight like someone who knows the music to come before he hears it. You external allies, they arrived at staggered times. The park ranger, with a clear radio frequency and a non-lethal deterrent kit, established an elastic perimeter that could advance and retreat without breaking the line. The volunteer veterinarian prepared emergency sedative in a safe dose for a large mammal, in case exhaustion turned the rescue into a clinical risk. A biology student, summoned at the last minute, brought a portable thermal sensor that, despite its modest range, could distinguish cold and warm masses in the skin of the night, drawing silhouettes where the eye would fail. No one had any heroism left. Everyone knew the plan was to contain, drive away, stabilize, not conquer. The marsh, indifferent, maintained its chorus of insects, and the tide drew invisible arrows in the mud that would guide the predator. The accumulation of evidence consolidated almost like a real-time report. The thermal sensor translated the nest into a cold spot surrounded by slightly warmer edges, a sign of a half-submerged body. Water moved by minimal displacements. The drone, now in higher and more stable flight, recorded the geometry of the ambush and showed, at regular intervals, the brief glow of its eyes near the surface. On the opposite bank, fresh moose tracks cut through the grass in two lines that approached the watering hole in an arc calculated to avoid deep mud. The usual map betrayed the animal. The technician mentally superimposed this data on the notebook notes and saw the lines coincide with uncomfortable precision. There were no more doubts to appease his conscience. With each confirmation, the mask that covered up the danger in the minds of skeptics lost its hold. Some curious people, previously ironic, kept a respectful distance, and the kayak merchant, who had minimized the risk, now watched in silence. A fall of the mask, the villain's story began on two fronts. On the natural front, the lizard lost its invisibility advantage. The thermal sensor betrayed it, the drone revealed it, the siren tested hours earlier marked a line it preferred not to cross. On the social front, the comfortable narrative collapsed when the student displayed freeze frames of its eyes aligned with the corridor of footprints, a repetition that no chance can sustain. The people remaining on the bank finally understood that this was no riverside myth. The predator was no legend. It was method. And method, exposed, demands a response. A big turnaround emerged from a painfully close place. The merchant who had presented himself as an ally from the beginning, the one who had lent tarpaulin, offered lanterns, and promised to spread the word about safe behavior, was recognized by the boatman inbait area left in the afternoon. The deep boot prints matched the pattern on its soles. A makeshift security camera from a nearby warehouse, checked by chance, had captured the unmistakable silhouette depositing bags near the trail. The intention wasn't to feed the predator, but lure the victim to film an exclusive meeting that would make the park resonate on social media. The gesture, blinded by vanity, shortened the distance and heightened the risk. When the realization dawned, the group quietly reassigned roles, aware that the internal betrayal weakened the ethical edge of the entire operation. The ally became a containment variable. Someone kept him away under the pretext of security, another recorded the evidence for the official report, the park ranger adjusted the perimeter to neutralize interference. A threat escalates, they often climb things ready to collapse. The tide began to recede, exposing the neck of the watering hole, and the moose, driven by thirst and habit, approached the critical range. The lizard raised its head slightly above the standard, calculating the line where its tail would best whip. A gust of wind displaced the scent of sedative and human sweat, and the reptile corrected its course with a slow, elegant, and fatal twist. At the same time, from the human side, a reckless metallic noise, tools striking stake, shattered the silence and generated the reaction no one wanted. The predator accelerated, breaking through the water like a blade, at an angle that threatened to sever the moose's flank before the rope found traction. The containment semicircle, trained for this scenario, opened tactically. The blanket erected a sudden wall between reptile and prey. The siren bit the air with a precise shrill. The jet was fired in front of the snout to break the calculus, not to hurt. The boat, transformed into an anchor, retracted the rope a precise span and returned a step of ground to the moose. The lizard, unable to execute the perfect turn, launched its tail in a sweep that tore through the grass and licked the edge of the blanket, forcing the guide to exert a force that grated the skin on his hands. The technician, alert to the wind, restrained the urge to repeat the spurt and waited for the micro-window of retreat. The park ranger, now in the field, expanded the silhouette with his body and the beam of light, adding mass to the visual obstacle. The reptile hesitated for the second it had already decided so many fates in that park, measured the sum of the stimuli, and chose to preserve itself. It retreated in a zigzag, spreading mud, and disappeared under the dark film of water with a silent promise to try again when the situation was more favorable. The scene did not end the tension, repositioned the board. The moose, lying on its side, trembled on the edge between shock and collapse, and the veterinarian approached with diagonal steps, gauging the risk of intervention. The community, which had witnessed part of the confrontation, understood firsthand what had previously seemed an exaggeration. The merchant, exposed and pale, saw his narrative wither before the evidence that his rush for visibility had almost fueled the tragedy. Evidence were consolidated right there. Recordings, coordinates, collected material, technical report. The perimeter was expanded to prevent further reckless approaches, and emergency behavior warnings were posted in simple, direct language. When the wind changed and brought the clean smell of cold water, the marsh seemed to regain, for a moment, its peaceful appearance. But now everyone knew that that peace was a tactical break, not a solution. The only thing left was final agreement, public and inescapable, in which each piece would be called by name, each consequence would be attributed to its gesture, and each life, human and animal, would understand the cost of choices. The path was open to the climax. The marsh transformed into an arena as the first official vehicles reached the shore, shining rotating lights on the dark skin of the water. The presence of authorities and onlookers erected invisible walls that compressed the scene toward the center, where the moose, trembling and lying down, caught its breath between sobs. The recordings, scales, and footprint maps were already circulating in steady hands. Anticipation, in turn, ran wild, searching for a gesture that would end the risk once and for all. The lizard was nowhere to be seen, but its design remained in every vein of the mud, like a fresh signature. The trio, now reinforced by a park ranger, a veterinarian, and a few disciplined volunteers, assumed the formation of a public containment, expanded and visible, so that the truth told there would not be lost in rumor. It was the peculiar moment when nature and community shared the same stage, and a poorly placed decision could reopen the ambush that had been so difficult to neutralize. The inevitable confrontation had happened when the tide turned, giving the predator a temporary advantage. A gentle shift beneath the reeds betrayed the approach, and the thermal sensor sketched a cold outline on the screen, widening toward the edge. The human semicircle thickened, the containment blanket opened completely in a single breath, the siren prepared for the precise cut of the air. The reptile emerged like a restrained blade, eyes aligned with the moose's hooves, head lowered according to the first rule of an efficient strike. The anchored boat reeled in the rope in a gesture that converted centimeters into survival, and the veterinarian remained midway, ready to intervene on the exhausted body if the voltage drop reopened the abyss. The narrow beam of the flashlights drew a clear corridor between predator and prey, not as an invitation, but as a boundary. The lizard stopped. He didn't stop out of respect, he stopped out of calculation. The sum of enlarged silhouettes, aggressive noise, vertical obstacles and shallow water made the attack too expensive for the currency of survival. A fall of the mask completed itself before everyone's eyes when the aerial footage projected, on improvised screens, the repeated script of the ambush. Polished nest, parallel corridors, precisely chosen tide times. What had been denied in hurried conversations asserted itself in the materiality of the images. The community finally saw the enemy of ignorance, which was not a specific animal, but the refusal to acknowledge the complexity of that ecosystem. The lizard, subjected to the accumulation of stimuli that reduced its advantage, turned its neck, ran in a zigzag retreat, and disappeared beneath the water, leaving behind only the vibration of the mud and the short breath of someone whose plan had been interrupted. The moose, supported, conquered a meter of solid ground, then another, until its legs found real support and its chest stopped sinking to the rhythm of the tide. Catharsis it spread like a warm wind. It was not a victorious cry, it was a breath recovered in chorus, the realization that life had been returned by a thread and that thread had been woven throughout a day of consecutive choices. From there, the narrative changed temperature and entered the territory of consequences. The veterinarian assessed stress fever, microinjuries, and severe fatigue, recommending monitored rest and slow hydration, without invasive interventions. The perimeter was redesigned with clear lines, with objective signage regarding tide times, risk zones, and mandatory conduct. The merchant identified with the bait was formally notified. His reckless participation resulted in a record, a fine, and a commitment to reparations, including training, equipment donation, and community service. Park staff instituted a minimal patrol routine at critical windows, and a local education program began there, under still-hot floodlights, so children and adults could learn to read signs that previously passed as background noise. The marsh, which always seems to be in the same place, had shifted somewhat in the collective understanding. It became less of a scene and more of a system. A pain of the innocent, it appeared in the little things. The moose, lying on hastily prepared dry grass, shivered from time to time as if a trace of cold water still ran over its skin. The residents who denied the evidence avoided the trio's eyes and, with the timid movement of lowering their heads, acknowledged without words the damage to their own certainties. Those who laughed at the warnings, now silent, endured a necessary shame for a few minutes. The marsh didn't charge interest, it simply returned the lesson in the language it knows. Cause and effect, time and tide, calculation and consequence. A community reaction matured in layers. Where once there had been a stage for exhibitionism, an almost ceremonial respect for procedures took hold. People began to maintain their distance without needing to repeat themselves, and schedules were open to support patrols and maintain walkways. The student who provided the drone set up a simple repository with the recordings and authorized its use in workshops. The guide offered interpretive trails that explained the difference between observing and interfering. The boatman adapted the business to safe hours and adopted, as a practice, reporting any anomaly with description and geotagging. The operation, which had been born of instinctive courage, evolved into a regular responsibility. No symbolic closure. The sun, already low, painted the water an antique copper. The team cleared a path, and the elk steadied, slowly rose, tested its legs, took a new deep breath, and walked toward the higher ground, where firm grass and cool shade promised rest without surprise. There was no noisy celebration. There was a thread of stillness that, for a few seconds, wove everyone together. The animal leaving, the humans who would remain, the predator relearning the map now guarding a gap in the distance, and the park, resuming its rhythm without pretending nothing had happened. The trio gathered ropes, cleaned the blanket, stowed flashlights, and signed reports. The park ranger spoke with his hands and pointed out new signs to be posted the following dawn. The veterinarian closed the case, pleased with the chance not to use it more than necessary. A final message settled like a stone placed in its right place. Truth, pushed by trials and courage, always reaches the surface, just as the tide always reaches its predicted shore. That night, the community learned to distinguish spectacle from protection, and the park gained a useful reminder, the kind that prevents fatal repetitions. The story that began with tension and a near-tragic outcome found, in the end, the serene contours of a possible reparation. And in the short space between the last reflection of the water and the first star, the question remained that opens new paths for those who saw it all up close. What other lives, human or animal, await a coordinated gesture that pulls them back from the edge of the abyss?